They didn't even give me time to grab the photo albums. 1 minute, the barn stood tall against. The rising sun weathered red boards glowing like embers, and the next, a bulldozer's teeth were chewing through its ribcage. Neighbors peeked from behind blinds, their shadows twitching like guilty ghosts. The ground shook, windows rattled, and all I could hear was the crunch of wood splintering into memories. Marlene Whitaker, queen of the HOA and self-appointed guardian of community aesthetics, stood on the curb with a clipboard in hand, sipping her coffee like she was watching a performance she'd paid for. I'll admit, it was one hell of a performance. Imagine this. You spend years restoring something. Your grandfather built with his own 2 hands a barn that carried the smell of hay and oil and summer storms. You stain it. You patch the roof. You keep it alive in a neighborhood obsessed with beige vinyl siding. Then, one morning, the sound of diesel engines becomes your alarm clock. And when you step outside in your flannel shirt, barefoot on the driveway, the first thing you see is Marlene smirking as if she's finally squashed the one blemish on her perfect HOA vision board. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me rewind. It started, like most HOA wars, with letters. Paper-thin threats folded neatly in envelopes, tucked against my mailbox like little landmines. Notice of violation, non-conforming structure. Failure to comply with community standards. Second warning. Each one signed in Marlene's looping cursive, as though that made the words any softer. I ignored the first, wrote a sarcastic note on the second, and by the third, I realized she wasn't playing. The barn had been standing long before the HOA was even formed. It wasn't some rusty heap or collapsed shed. Sure, the paint peeled in spots and a few boards leaned at angles, but it was solid. It was history. But the bylaws, as Marlene reminded me at every meeting, clearly stated that all structures visible from the street must conform to approved design palettes and architectural standards. Translation: if it isn't beige, brick, or stucco, it's an abomination. At the monthly HOA meeting, I stood up to plead my case. "This isn't just a barn," I said, gripping the podium like a lifeline. "It's family. My grandfather built it before half these houses even existed. It's not an eyesore, it's a landmark." Marlene pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose, a smile playing on her lips. "While we all respect your sentimentality, the structure is in violation. Multiple residents have complained. Our job is to maintain property values." A man in the back coughed. A woman scribbled notes like this was the Supreme Court. The entire room smelled of stale coffee and tension. "Funny," I shot back. "I don't see anyone complaining when people leave inflatable Santas rotting on their lawns until March." A few chuckles broke out, but Marlene's smile hardened. She tapped her pen against the clipboard, and that sound, click, 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 was the sound of the verdict. The next letter didn't come with a fine. It came with a date. Demolition scheduled, June 15th. I thought it was a bluff. I thought, surely, even Marlene wasn't bold enough to tear down something that wasn't hers. But when the sunrise of June 15th lit up my bedroom, the rumble of engines answered my doubt. They brought in the heavy machinery like it was a county fair attraction. I stormed out, waving my arms. "You can't just do this. This is private property." Marlene, calm as a judge, handed me a copy of the bylaws. "We have board approval. You were given ample notice." "Ample notice? You gave me threats and a date." Behind me, the barn groaned as the bulldozer took another bite. Dust rose in the air, thick and bitter, coating my tongue. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering, not daring to intervene. I caught sight of Mr. Jensen from across the street shaking his head as if to say, "Don't fight it." But I did fight it. I screamed. I shouted. I called the county, the sheriff's office, anyone who might stop the madness. They all shrugged it off. The HOA had filed permits, and technically they had the authority. Technically. By noon, the barn was nothing but a pile of splintered wood and dust. I stood barefoot in the gravel, chest heaving, watching my grandfather's work reduced to rubble. Marlene handed me one last slip of paper. "You'll be billed for removal. she said sweetly, then turned on her heel and walked away. It's funny, isn't it? How one act can change the way you see everything. Until that morning, the HOA was just a nuisance, a background hum in suburban life. But now, as I stared at the ruins of that barn, I realized something Marlene never considered. The lake. The sparkling jewel of the neighborhood, centerpiece of every brochure and every house tour. Residents boasted about their paddle boats, their fishing weekends, their lakeside barbecues. But what none of them seemed to know, not even Marlene, was that the lake wasn't fed by some natural spring or municipal source. It was fed by a pipe, and at the end of that pipe sat a valve. My valve. And as I stood there, hands clenched, dust in my lungs, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. They had just declared war. "You know this lake doesn't even belong to you, right?" I said, swirling my glass of cheap iced tea while the rest of them sipped champagne. That shut them up at least for a heartbeat. Marlene's smile froze halfway. The kind of smile a queen holds when she realizes the court jester might have teeth. The music kept playing. Neighbors kept laughing, and paddle boats still bumped lazily against the dock. But suddenly, every eye darted between her and me. That was the first time I let the truth slip. The truth they'd never bothered to consider. The truth that all their wine-fueled brunches and lakefront selfies depended on one little wheel of iron buried on my property, my valve, my choice, but I'm getting ahead of myself again. That day started like something out of a glossy brochure. The HOA had sent out invitations printed on thick cream cardstock. Summer champagne brunch at the lakefront pavilion. They called it a celebration of community spirit. I called it a victory lap, Marlene's chance to show off her empire. When I walked down to the pavilion, the air was thick with sunscreen, grilled salmon, and smugness. White tents billowed in the breeze, the lake sparkled like a postcard, and Marlene stood at the head table in a floral dress, her pearls gleaming almost as bright as her teeth. "Isn't it wonderful?" she cooed to a cluster of homeowners. "When I became president, this lake was a stagnant pond. Now look at it flourishing, beautiful, a true gem of our community. It's all thanks to our board's dedication to preserving property values." Property values. She loved that phrase. She said it like a preacher says salvation, as if the phrase itself could wipe away sins. I leaned against the railing, watching paddle boats drift across the water. Kids tossed breadcrumbs to ducks. Couples snapped selfies, and everyone acted like this lake had always been here. A natural blessing. No one seemed to notice that just a quarter-mile away, behind a chain-link fence and a grove of cottonwoods, there sat a weathered steel valve controlling the entire illusion. When my grandfather put in that irrigation system decades ago, it was meant for farming, a way to divert water to keep crops alive through dry summers. Over the years, as the farmland was carved into cul-de-sacs and sold to people desperate for country living with modern charm, the lake became the selling point. The developers called it Lake Marigold, even though it had no real source. They built docks, added paddle boats, strung fairy lights. But the HOA never owned the valve. It stayed on my land, overlooked, forgotten until now. Here's the irony. Marlene never once mentioned the lake in her endless violation letters. She was obsessed with my barn, my lawn height, the color of my mailbox, but the thing her little kingdom actually depended on. She ignored it. That ignorance was about to cost her. The whispers started at the brunch. I caught snippets as I mingled through the crowd. Can you believe they fined the Millers for having clover in their lawn, but the board just spent $3,000 on new deck chairs? I heard Marlene's niece got paid to do the landscaping, and it looks worse than before. They say we can't paint our shutters navy blue, but she throws parties every month with HOA funds. It was delicious, watching the cracks spread in her perfect facade. People weren't blind. They just needed someone to point out the hypocrisy. That someone was me. At one point, she clinked her glass and called for attention. "Neighbors, friends," she began, her voice smooth as butter. "Today, we celebrate not only this beautiful lake, but our unity, our shared vision for a thriving community. When we stand together, there is nothing we cannot achieve. I couldn't help myself. I raised my glass of iced tea and said loudly, "Except maybe respecting private property." The pavilion went quiet. Head swiveled, Marlene's eyes narrowed, but she forced a laugh. "Oh, you always have such a sense of humor." "Not a joke," I replied, taking a slow sip. "Just reminding everyone that this beautiful lake you keep bragging about runs through my irrigation system. Which means, technically, it's my water making your parties possible." There it was. The shift. You could feel the air tighten, like the moment before a storm breaks. Neighbors glanced at each other uncertain. A few frowned, a few smirked. Marlene's pearls seemed to strangle her as she turned back to me. "Your property is part of the community," she said sweetly, but her eyes were sharp. "And as such, it benefits from our management." "Funny," I said. "Didn't feel like much of a benefit when you demolished my barn." Her smile cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but I saw it. The rest of the brunch carried on, but the tension lingered like smoke. I noticed fewer people laughing, more people whispering, more eyes darting toward the lake as if they were suddenly wondering, "Wait, what if he's serious?" By the time I walked home, the sun was high and the champagne was gone, but the seed was planted. Marlene thought she could erase my past with her bulldozers and bylaws, but she'd forgotten the one thing that gave her power was sitting under my lock and key. That night, I stood by the chain-link fence, staring at the valve. The metal wheel was cool beneath my hand, heavy with possibility. I didn't turn it, not yet. Timing was everything. And revenge, like good barbecue, is best slow-cooked. But I whispered to the still water under the moonlight, a promise carried by the crickets and the hum of distant lawnmowers. "Enjoy your lake, Marlene, while it lasts." By sunrise, the ducks were walking. That was the first sign. Paddle boats sat tilted in the muck like abandoned toys, their plastic hulls creaking in the morning breeze. Fish flopped helplessly in puddles, the water receding so fast it looked like the earth was swallowing the lake whole. Neighbors screamed, kids cried, and the perfect jewel of Marigold Estates had cracked into a mud basin overnight. And me? I sat on my porch with a mug of coffee, calm as a preacher at Sunday service, watching the chaos unravel at the shoreline. That's when Marlene came storming up my driveway. He wasn't wearing pearls this time. She was wearing rage. Her heels stabbed into the pavement like nails in a coffin. Her floral blouse already damp with sweat, clipboard clutched in her hand like a weapon. "What did you do?" she hissed, though half the neighborhood was already gathered, watching from the sidewalks. And, oh, the delicious irony of it. For months, Marlene had treated me like the neighborhood villain, a rebel to be dealt with. She'd torn down my barn, fined me for grass height, lectured me about community standards. But now the very community she championed was turning to mud, and they were looking at her, not me. She was the queen of the HOA, and her crown had just washed away with the last trickle of water. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. The night before, I'd stood by the valve under a full harvest moon. The wheel was stiff, rusty from years of neglect, but my hands didn't hesitate. One slow turn, then another, the metal groaning like it had waited decades for this moment. I shut it tight, locked it. Walked home in silence, every step echoing like a drum roll. Did I feel guilty? Maybe for a second. Then I remembered the bulldozer chewing through my grandfather's barn while Marlene sipped coffee. I remembered her syrupy voice at the meetings dismissing my protests as sentimental. I remembered the brunch, her bragging about the lake as if she'd built it with her own 2 hands. Guilt didn't stand a chance. By dawn, the results were undeniable. The lake wasn't a lake anymore. It was a crater of cracked earth and stranded boats. HOA flyers promising resort-style living were suddenly a joke. Neighbors dragged hoses to try to save their flower beds as the humidity rose off the muddy basin. The smell was thick, swampy, like rotting leaves and sour algae. And then came the knock. Not a polite knock, either a full-on pounding. I opened the door to Marlene's fury. "You turned it off," she accused, voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Morning to you too," I said, sipping my coffee. "This is sabotage. Do you realize what you've done?" I raised an eyebrow. "Looks like I've leveled the playing field. No barn for me, no lake for you." She shoved the clipboard at me, papers fluttering. "The HOA bylaws give us authority over all common areas and amenities. This is destruction of communal property." "Funny," I said, scanning the paper, "because according to county records, that valve is on my land, my property, which means this little amenity you've been bragging about runs on my good graces. Or did you forget to read that part?" Her face flushed, a blotchy red creeping up her neck. Behind her, the crowd was growing, neighbors whispering, some with arms crossed, some shaking their heads. "Fix this," she demanded, her voice cracking. "Right now." I leaned against the doorframe, letting the silence stretch. The weight of every angry neighbor fell on her shoulders, not mine. For once, Marlene wasn't the one holding the gavel. "Here's the thing," I said slowly. "You can't bulldoze history and expect me to just smile about it. You tore down something irreplaceable. That barn was my family's story. Now your story has a hole in it, too." Her lips trembled, and for a second I thought she might lunge at me. Instead, she straightened, forced a brittle smile, and lowered her voice. "You think this makes you the hero," she said. "You've just made enemies of everyone in this neighborhood. Every single one." The words were meant to sting, but all I heard was the faint slap of fishtails in the distance, the sound of a lake gasping its last. I smiled. "Then I guess I won't be bored." The crowd murmured, a mix of shock and awe. Some neighbors were angry, sure, but others, oh, I saw it in their eyes, were thrilled. They'd suffered her fines, her double standards, her endless talk of property values. And now someone had finally taken her down a peg. Marlene turned and stormed off, but not before pointing a finger back at me. "This isn't over," she spat. And she was right, because later that night, long after the sun baked the mud into cracked tiles, I spotted a group of board members huddled under the pavilion lights, papers spread across the table, phones pressed to ears, their voices sharp and hurried. They were plotting, planning, desperate to claw back control. As I watched from the shadows, a smile tugged at my lips. The barn was gone. The lake was gone. And now the gloves were off.